for a broken world. Take me as I am tonight, grateful just to be alive. Life is a miracle. Can you see more love, more light? Darkness don't stand a chance against us. More love, more light. Darkness don't stand a chance against us. Life is a miracle. Can you see? More light. Darkness don't stand a chance against us. More love, more light. Darkness don't stand a chance against us. More love.
Well, a special welcome to all of you to our ongoing seminar, which is going to take us to our way back home, as it's called, the Keys to Emergence. And I want to thank right now Lili, virtuoso violinist, Grammy Award winner Lili Hadyn, for that beautiful piece of music, really uplifting. Thank you, Lili. And I want to welcome, I'm really honored to have some amazing guests with me today, Dr. Drew Pinsky and Marianne Williamson, and I'll do more formal introductions in a few moments. But I think all of us have been struggling through this period of COVID. And in what I do for a living as a rabbi, I'm seeing it in a lot of issues, people struggling with depression, with anxiety, with isolation, with burnout. I'm seeing it in a lot of different ways as I communicate with people and meet with them. I was just saying recently that every experience has changed. The bread and butter of a lot of what I do, weddings, bar mitzvahs, baby naming, celebrations, all have been either postponed or put off completely, or they've changed in the way we conduct them, with a lot of Zooming people in, family, relatives, loved ones. I performed a wedding recently because the couple said, we're not going to let COVID stop us. We're getting married. It was just myself, the bride and groom, and we Zoomed in about 50 people from around the country, their family and closest friends. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how we emerge through this time and what are some of the keys to resiliency, which is so critical to getting through every experience. You know, we were originally told that these lockdowns, which have been pretty severe, that they were designed to flatten the curve, to ease the spread, to ease overburdening of our intensive care units and our hospitals. But I think what we missed is a lot of what we call the collateral damage, the impacts that we've had, the disorientation, the isolation of seniors, children who can't socialize with friends, heightened increased numbers of addictions and suicides. All of this impacted us in ways that maybe we didn't anticipate or should have anticipated. But as I started to look through this, my experience and what I could glean and learn from others, and I think that's the best way for us to grow in life, is to learn from everyone as potential teacher and has something to offer. One of the areas that I looked at, interestingly, was business school, an MBA program, and they talked about the change that COVID has had on the workplace, not just in the reduction of the number of offices as people telecommute, they work from home, but also what are the skill sets you need for your business to emerge, for you as a professional to be able to get through it. And they came up with a formula, and the formula was flexibility plus agility equals resilience. And I thought that was really interesting, especially flexibility. I lived in Florida for a couple of years, and I went through a couple of really bad hurricane seasons there. And if you know, Florida has these beautiful coconut palm trees. And after each hurricane, I'd go and look out at a park where these beautiful coconut palms were. And I found something really interesting. They may have lost a few coconuts, but they weren't uprooted or overturned. Because if you look at a coconut palm, it bends with the wind. And that, for me, was a metaphor of what we need in terms of our own internal flexibility to get through times like this. If resiliency is in part the ability to bounce back from tough circumstances, from setbacks, from failures, from adverse situations, then we have to ask, what steps can we take? And I've come across a few that I offer as suggestions, and then I'm looking forward to hearing the brilliance my guests have to offer on this subject from personal experience and from their life experience. But one of them was to recognize the power of opposition. We're standing in opposition to this dreadful pandemic. And sometimes you can't build muscle without resistance. And sometimes that resistance, you can't build your mental muscle without also having some kind of adverse circumstances that you get through. So that resistance can't be only seen in a negative light. It has to be seen as an opportunity for growth, maybe in places you didn't anticipate or desire. One of my colleagues wrote a book about 20 years ago that I loved about people emerging from tough situations. It was called Through Storms, We Grow. And it's through those experiences that we wouldn't wish on ourselves that we really find some spectacular growth. The other suggestion, besides recognizing this, is staying networked. It's so important. So many people have retreated into isolation during this time, feeling that there's no hope, there's no future. And it's so vital to keep lines of communication open and to have that frequent connection. It's so important in terms of strengthening the relationships that help us get through these kinds of experiences. And thirdly, I think it's really important what we feed our minds. You know, you are what you eat. You feed yourself a healthy diet, you will tend to be more healthy. What we feed our mind really matters. The barrage of negative news and negative input that we get, we have to control that, minimize that, because it can impact us. And, you know, people tell me I can't stand watching the news anymore. If they watch MSNBC, they're just terrified at all the terrible things the previous administration did. And if they're watching Fox News, they're terrified at all the terrible things, mostly imaginary, that this administration is doing. So you've got to tune that out to some degree and allow strengthening, peaceful messages to come through. And that is something within your control. Lastly, I think focusing on a plan of action. One of my friends bought about 30 of those courses online, the great courses. They learned a lot about art and music, and they engaged in their own educational growth. And those are things you can do. You can look for solutions to this pandemic fatigue in the things you do that enable you to grow as a human being. And I think for me, a very important part of that is prayer, meditation, walking, bathing, rituals that enhance our life and our desire to go on living. And I do a ritual every morning and evening that's primarily a gratitude meditation. And it helps me get through each and every day so that, it's not the same day every day. Every day is distinctive and different and offers growth in a variety of different areas. So those are a few of the areas I think about when I think about keys to resiliency, which will help us emerge, because we're going to go back. And I hope we don't go back to mindless consumer consumption and mindless activities, but we really stay centered and focused on what we learned from this experience, that we grew from it in some way. We're going to look back 10 years from now or 20 years from now, and our kids will as well, and they'll say, oh, remember the pandemic of 2020? I lived through that. And we want them to be able to say that, having achieved greater in personal integrity and internal strength. So with that, I'm going to turn things over now to Dr. Drew Pinsky. And I'm really honored to have Dr. Drew with us, a physician, addiction specialist, the great Dr. Drew Pinsky podcast that I've enjoyed listening to, which you can go to drdrew.com and you'll find out more about that. I used to listen, Dr. Drew, to your old Loveline show. Do you remember that show? It was excellent.
Do I remember? I did it for 35 years. I think I do remember it.
Well, some people try and put some things out of their mind, but I'm glad you remember it. So if you would share with us, because of the experience you had directly with COVID, how you emerged from it, what was going on in your mind that gave you the belief you would come through?
Okay. I'm having a bit of a Rorschach experience listening to the rabbi speak, and I agree with 100% of everything he said. And I hope my presentation does not come off like a Rorschach, because I'm having a kind of rush of ideas and thoughts here. Let me just address your first question, which is how I got through COVID. I had moderate to severe COVID. I was sick for about 10 weeks. I had long hauler syndrome. I had all kinds of stuff going on. And there's been a little bit of a death of math through this whole experience. As I sat with moderate to severe COVID, the probability of me dying was 1%. When a doctor tells you you have 1% probability of anything, he or she is telling you, forget it, don't think about it. What we don't think about, though, is there's about a 20% morbidity rate with this illness with moderate to severe cases. And I certainly suffered that. It was like getting hit in the head. It was like having a severe traumatic brain injury. I had all kinds of lung problems. The morbidity of this thing needs to be emphasized a little more. But in terms of, so I didn't worry about mortality. I was impressed by the morbidity and the relentlessness of this thing, relentlessness. But in terms of getting through, I read a lot of Epictetus and Stoic philosophy and Marcus Aurelius. It had great purpose for me, had great use when things are going bad. And I made meaning of it. Back to your point about adaptability. We are meaning-making organisms. Making meaning is how we create purpose and how we feel like we're living a life worth lived. And so I started learning things as a patient. And by the way, one of the things I have left over from COVID is terrible ringing in my right ear, which is troubling me right now if I get distracted by that, and word finding difficulty. But I decided I was going to chronicle my illness and see if I could give the patient perspective. And lo and behold, throughout the course of the illness, I learned a ton about how to stay out of the hospital. And I realized my peers in general medicine had become paralyzed. There was a very strange phenomenon that happened with general medicine where we became fearful of improvising, which is what we do constantly in medicine. We improvise and we use our clinical judgment before the science ever catches up with us. And for some reason, there was this, because of social media, because of all the fear mongering and the panic porn, my peers were subjected to that and became just paralyzed. And unless there was some orthodoxy handed down from authority, they were fearful of doing things like the things I got, using high-dose steroids when I got the lung involvement, monoclonal antibodies, which were available literally months before doctors started prescribing it, and it was free, available to everybody. So this to me was deeply troubling. So I went out to try to make meaning of this experience by educating people, which I thought the public health department should be doing. If unburdening the hospital system was our goal, teach people how to stay out of the hospital, teach people how to use telemedicine, inform them about talking to their doctor about monoclonal antibodies and Decadron and some of the other treatments that are available. And now we have a lot of therapeutic options. It's moved forward very quickly. We're going to have good antivirals soon. We have things like tocilizumab that will deal with the cytokine storm. So the therapeutics is moving rapidly, but you as a patient need to be informed so you can understand what good care is and how to stay out of the hospital. The other thing I had, that sort of sense I had with this illness was like, wow, if this thing gets away, I could feel it getting away. And I thought, wow, if this gets away, I'm going to be in trouble. And so I, working with a physician on the phone, he didn't have to see me. We could do a ton on the phone or through Zoom, and started doing some aggressive management that worked and kept me out of the hospital. But again, the morbidity remained. But I don't want to get into that today. I must tell you, I want to step back from all that. I could regale you with data about anxiety and depression and addictions out of control and suicides and overdoses. It's all out of control. Whenever I talk to my psychiatric colleagues, they just say, I go, what are you seeing? Anxiety, depression, anxiety, depression, anxiety, depression, anxiety, depression, suicide, anxiety, depression, especially in the 8 to 15-year-old group. When we look back at this experience, one of the most serious misadventures of this entire experience will be the closure of schools. Not only are we, you had mentioned social phobia, Rabbi, and isolation. Think about the fact that a year or two during critical periods of development, when you're supposed to be developing the capacity for social interaction, not only do we withdraw you from that, but we tell you if you go near another person, you're killing your grandmother. Your grandmother's going to die because you got near that patient, that person. Stay 6 feet away, don't touch, don't breathe. I mean, the level of social anxiety right now in the sort of I really very concerned about the 8 to 15-year-old category. And of course, suicide is off the chain. I don't want to do that. I don't want to go there. I want to step back and I want to speak philosophically for a couple of minutes. And I want to talk about the other, and the other meaning other humans, and they're important for let's use the general concept of adaptability. What do we mean when we say adaptability? And let me just preface this all by saying, look, for humans, the other is the source of self. Your self emerges in a relationship with other, initially mom and dad. Your ability to create meaning making and purpose is for and with other human beings. I cannot emphasize the power of this. And I feel as though we have been in a spiritual vacuum that has amplified through COVID. And I want to build the case that commune, attachment, connection with others is where everybody can find a spiritual connection. Now, we have differing ideas about spirituality, but I think in almost all cases, religion and spirituality involves a relationship with something. And often that something is a community, a person, or a idea of a personhood of some sort. And those relationships really are what give us meaning and adaptability. So how do we develop, it begs the issue, how does a normal person develop the capacity for flexible emotional regulation? It turns out there's a very specific interaction that occurs. I'll use mother and child as sort of the paradigm, where a child is born in this world awash in emotions. Primary emotions come over us. We can't name them. We don't have language yet. We can't regulate them. They just come over us. Mom examines us when we're having those emotions. We learn through that examination that brains have content. And mom does something very specific, is once she identifies by attunement, by literally two bodies in space, and this is a really important piece of this, it's why Zoom is not adequate. Zoom is good. I was surprised, in fact, how much Zoom carried my patients through in terms of 12-step meetings on Zoom and the mutual aid societies that kept going on Zoom, but it petered out. It sort of lost the air came out of the balloon about 9 months where it couldn't sustain. And the reason it couldn't sustain is you need bodies in space. You need actual two human beings in two bodies relating. There's so much information that goes back and forth between people that we are not consciously aware of. It starts all the way back to this initial interaction that I mentioned with mom. And mom, when she is able to attune, and literally the heart rates become timed together, the hippus of the pupils start timing together. This is what humans are designed to do. And when that happens, the mom has a very subtle experience, which is she on her face will reflect a a version of the child's feelings. I mean, think about what we do when a child hurts himself. You go, you hurt yourself. You reflect on your face with a pretend version of the child's affect state. You don't get overcome by the affect. It's not a contagion. It's a boundary and a bodily based attunement and appreciation of what's going on in the other, and then a second order representation on the face. It's called reflective function. And the child literally learns that's my feeling. And soothing affects are provided alongside of that. And that interaction, millions and millions of times, is what gives us the landscape to A, regulate our emotions and thereby be adaptable, and B, understand and develop a robust connection with this spontaneous thing we call feelings that emanate from our body. So let me sort of, I've got a lot of ground to cover and just a few minutes to do it. I want to talk about something, step away from that now and talk about something called the vampire effect. There's a famous Yale philosopher named L.A. Paul, and she has a really interesting thought experiment which says, how about a vampire shows up and says, I want to turn you into a vampire. You'll have to cash in your soul, but you'll live forever. And it's really great being a vampire. It's fantastic. I love it. It's the greatest thing. But, there's some things you'll have to leave behind. This is what happens, believe it or not, in therapy. People become a vampire. They become something they were not. And the human brain fights like hell against that kind of change. And to be presented with it in that kind of a thought experiment sort of points out how peculiar it is for just to think about giving up on a present self in the name of a future self. Even though that future self may be better, it's still an unknown. It still means a grief in response to the loss of the current self. But we have to be aware of these choices. Look, just becoming a parent is like becoming a vampire. Become a doctor I don't know what the doctor self was like until I became a doctor. I don't know what it was like to be a parent. These experiential phenomenologies are critical in going forward and growing. And I think we've been locked in this idea that words and thoughts and concepts are where we need to go. But I want to emphasize the importance of experience in terms of building that growth, that the presence of the other in terms of these emotional exchanges I'm talking about is a critical part of developing that growth and that landscape of feelings and emotional attunement and differing concepts of ourselves. And consider this thought experiment. And I've met anybody that sort of thinks about philosophy has seen this experiment before, this thought experiment, but I want to focus on something specific about it. If I had infinite powers and I could take your skull out of your head and put you as a brain in a vat, and as the brain in the vat, you could have the perfect life. It's kind of like being the vampire again, right? So the brain in the vat is another vampire state. And once you're the brain in the vat, you would not know you were the brain in the vat. This is a special subset of the vampire effect that the vampire as a thought experiment actually misses. So you're a brain in the vat, you're having the perfect life. I have infinity powers. So because I can have these infinity powers, I can constantly change whatever it is you need to be the perfect life, but you don't know that you're in the vat. You don't know. So would you sign up? Would you sign up to be a brain in the vat, to have the perfect life, to be the vampire? Most people say no. Most people say no. And when you really examine what the reason is that makes them hesitate, even though they wouldn't know their brain in the vat, even though my infinity powers would give them constant and re-updated perfection in their existence, there's one thing, the circumstance of being brain in the vat, I cannot change. And that is that you will cease to exist to important people in your lives. You think you exist to them because you'll be the brain in the vat and you'll still have a relationship with everybody you want to have a relationship with, but the reality, you will not exist. You in the world will not be here. And we are so tied to the other that we're willing to forego the perfect existence. And I would go one step further and say, not only is it our sense of purpose, our sense of beinghood is actually tied to the other, and I would say our spiritual landscape is very deeply attuned to some of the magic that goes on between people, and we don't emphasize that enough. But that personhood is not just the only part of the story. Another part of the story that people need, and again, being a brain in the vat doing this misses the point, is being service to others, being available to others. doing things in the world, changing things in a positive way for other human beings. You know, it's interesting to me that Aristotle kind of picked up on this, and he felt that to have a happiness, it was actually mistranslated. He used a word called eudaimonia, and he actually was talking about flourishing, like a fully, again, the word finding difficulty from COVID is upon me. If a flourishing existence, let's say, fully fulfilled, a fulfilled existence is probably a better way of thinking about this. And he really felt that that meant about leading a good life. And a good life may not always be happy. I mean, did Jesus lead a good life? Was he happy the whole way? He led a good life, happy the whole way? Not so much.
Moses either, for that.
That's right. And we've actually gotten confused in this world about, any great leader that sacrificed, David, you name it. They did things on behalf of others that were very uncomfortable and may have not worked out for them, but it was still a good life. And the importance of leading a good life is so vital to most of us, again, that we will forego the brain in the vat perfect existence. And Aristotle, again, he picked up on this, and for a eudaimonic existence, he added two things that we miss out on a little bit in this country. He said, you've got to have techne, which is skill, and you have to have phronesis, which is wisdom. And the way I think about it, like I feel very fortunate. I'm very grateful. You mentioned gratitude, Rabbi, and that's a very, when people are grateful, it's a huge sign of mental health, frankly, of well-being. I'm very grateful to have the skills as a physician where I can do something for another person that makes a real difference. That is filling. That is rewarding. That is renewing in a way that almost nothing is. We all want to do things on a large scale and help lots of people. And I don't want to discourage people from that, but that's not the same as having a skill and to intimately be of service to another human being. That is the most fulfilling thing we have. And you don't get that. You only think you got it as a brain in the vat. So we are willing to not be a vampire. We are willing to forego eternal existence as a vampire. We're willing to forego the perfect existence as a brain in the vat if it means we can't be with others and be of service to others.
Thank you, Dr. Drew. That's a perfect segue into being of service, being part of the community, teaching love to Marianne Williamson. Marianne is a good friend. She's a spiritual thought teacher extraordinaire, best-selling author, political activist. Many of you remember she ran for the presidency of the United States on the Democratic side and Democrat Party side. And Marianne, Dr. Drew set a beautiful table, and I'd like you to select from it being of service. You've taught so much about love, loving, giving of yourself, connecting in the community. That's the most powerful emotion we have, that one of love that drives us to do things that we might not otherwise ever do. So I'd like you to share some of your insights on how you personally emerged from this COVID experience and what you think are the tools that we can take to grow and flourish in the days ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi, and thank you. Every word that has been spoken has been profound. I've learned so much already, and it's been a very rich conversation, starting with Lili. How beautiful that was. And of course, one of the most inspiring moments was when all those voices came together. There's been a lot of that, some of the symphonic sharings, et cetera, from around the world, some of the choir pieces that we've all seen. I think that there have been many experiences like that where the combination of people and combination of voices inspired us perhaps in ways more than we would have been inspired had we been in an audience somewhere and the choir would have just been a veil. So thank you, and thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, Drew, for all the great things that you have already said. I was reading an article about a woman who was a photographer for British Vogue magazine during World War II. And it was a fascinating article about not only her world, how she transitioned from ultimately from fashion photography to war photography, but also the role that British Vogue magazine played during World War II. First of all, something 90% of all British women read British Vogue, and the government used the magazine in very significant ways to communicate with British women about what they needed to do and how they could contribute to the war effort. And whenever you read stories about World War II, and this is not only what I have read, such as that story, but also stories from my own parents, particularly my mother, because the generation that fought World War II, which was my parents' generation, for the most part, what happened there stayed there. The men didn't necessarily talk about it much when they came home. Certainly my father didn't, and I think that that was true of a lot of men, but my mother talked about it. And one thing that you hear clearly is that everybody knew they were going through this together. Nobody had the illusion this is only happening to me. I remember when I was in college, I was in California, Southern California, there was an earthquake. I was living in a dorm. The earthquake happened, it was a big deal. Everybody ran out of their room into the hallway. But there was this one girl, I was a freshman in college, and there was this one girl who stayed in her bed going, help me, help me. And we all burst out laughing, like, what, she thinks this is only about her? And I realized when I read about World War II, how much that was the myofascial that kept everybody together, that they knew that it's not just about you. And I think there's a lot for us to look at here, because isolation is not just something that's a consequence of COVID. Over isolation is part of what created the problem to begin with. We were social distancing before this happened, everybody. Let's stop kidding ourselves. We were already a culture where you would go to a restaurant and you'd see people on a date or at a movie, and they're both looking at their screens. They're not talking to each other. So this idea that we were in such community before this happened, hello. And the fact that we have become a society where there is so much legitimization of self-centeredness, so much legitimization of narcissism. I mean, everybody goes to the therapy and talks about how your husband is a narcissist or your boyfriend is a narcissist, maybe not thinking about the fact that maybe he's on the other side talking to his therapist about what a narcissist you are. We're always talking, right? About how, so the narcissism, they isolate the self-centeredness, and now all of a sudden something's happened and we realize we're lonely. Well, the truth of the matter is, if we had not become a society with such over focus on the individual to begin with, you know, in the United States, we pride ourselves on a characterological strength, which is rugged individualism. But this has transitioned over the last few years into rugged narcissism. This exaltation of the individual, which is license parading as freedom, which is self-actualization, which is the absence of self-actualization, which is narcissism masquerading as self-care, selfishness masquerading as self-care. And if we had not already gone there, if that had not already been such a trend and such a trajectory for years now, I don't think that we would have elected a government that got away with treating this disease to begin with such lack of focus on the communal experience and our need to be there for each other. The fact that a presidential administration got away with not treating this as something where we needed to take care of one another, where they didn't feel the need to legitimize the need of each one of us to take care of each other, actually kept alive, that kept in place the petri dish out of which has then emerged all this pain that people feel from being so lonely. It's like Drew said, you can't have community without service to one another. And as the rabbi was indicating, you can't have a spiritual experience without an experience of community. I heard somebody say that they thought that the entire COVID experience is like Mother Nature saying, go to your room and think about what you've done. Now, first of all, there are a few elements here. Number one, I would submit to you that the majority of people watching this right now don't have a clue the economic stress that is being experienced by millions and millions and millions of people living in this country right now. And we have legitimized permission that we give ourselves to lack perspective in the way we see our own problems. Yeah, there's a war Just like during World War II, there was a war going on. There was a war against us. COVID is a war against us. But you know what? Everybody's suffering. And just that right there, that knowledge right there, we have so legitimized a cultural conversation in it's all about me. And if I've learned, if there's any demonic thought, it's the thought that it's all about me. That's what the cancer cell is. And what has happened to the human race is we have been infected by a malignant thought. When a cell forgets that it's here to collaborate, that it's intelligent, the intelligence of the cell is its collaborative function. And the collaboration of the various cells are what support the healthy function of the organ and the organism of which they are part. When any cell forgets its collaborative function and goes insane and goes off to build its own kingdom over here and brings together other cells who are similarly insane, that's called a tumor. It's called a cancerous tumor. It is dangerous, and it will, if allowed to, destroy the entire body. And then, of course, the cell will die themselves. This is a disease that was upon us before COVID. This is not a disease that was created by COVID. COVID, in many ways, was created by the disease. And the fact that we have been so inept, not only our government, but our primary cultural response. When you look at the countries, look at a country like New Zealand. They don't even have, the virus isn't there anymore. And from the beginning, when you read about the countries that have done the best with the disease, those who have dealt with the virus the best were countries in which it was understood that this was something they were going through together. Now, I understand, and I certainly, everything the rabbi said was true, everything Drew said was true. These are very important points. Truth is like a kaleidoscope. We all have different parts and aspects of it. But you know what, guys? Bodies being together isn't everything, because bodies can be together and people still be very, very isolated. The walls that separate us from other people are not just physical. The walls that separate us most from other people are up here. And I have found for me, this year has been, and I think it's been for a lot of people. I love the thing that the rabbi said about listening to great classes. I mean, this has been, we are living in a society, not just the legitimization of self-reference, but the legitimization of this kind of constant freneticism that keeps us distracted and gives us permission to not go deep. Blaise Pascal said every problem is rooted in man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And when I said Mother Nature is saying, why don't you just sit there and think about a few things? We're a culture which would like chickens with our heads chopped off. And a lot of the moving and a lot of the going around and doing stuff, and it's a distractedness from depth. And one of the reasons this has been so painful is there's nothing to do but look at your stuff. And this is our salvation. This is the only hope we have moving forward. What are you doing? Because if we don't have a deep internal conversation within our own hearts and among ourselves, what are you doing? Look at the attacks on your democracy. Look at the attacks on your planet. Look at the attacks on animals. Look at these, what Drew was talking about with our kids. Although, Drew, it's interesting if we talk later, I also feel, in addition to what you were saying about the lack of socialization with these kids, other children, I think there's also something here. And I say this as a question, but I think it's something for us to look at. Something's wrong that it's so horrible for kids to be around their parents so much. Something is wrong with the bonding and the attachment that we have to be so afraid of that as well. Something is wrong. Do you know what I'm saying? I think there's something for us to look at there as well.
Well, so, Marianne, I want to jump in just for a second to say this has been an area of your great interest and teaching. And I know you're doing an online course called Reality and Relationships, and you can preview it. It's on the 19th of this month, and you can just preview it by going to marianne.com. We've been stuck with whomever we might be with during this time. Question that I'll piggyback on what you were saying, you were asking Drew, Dr. Drew, has this caused more divorce or deeper love and appreciation of one another?
I think clearly there are people learn a lot about their relationships when they're stuck in an apartment or a house alone like this. There's no doubt about that. And there will be information that will be coming out for years to come. I think a lot of what's going on right now, physically, emotionally, psychologically, culturally, politically, economically, we'll be learning about this and the consequences of all this for the next 20 years. And I think clearly some relationships have gotten stronger. Some relationships have not and will not survive. But once again, I think the deeper issues of relationship do not have to do so much with whether we are physically with someone, but rather whether we forgive, whether we're willing to let go the past, whether we are willing to think about someone more than just ourselves, whether we are willing to let go our sense of how other people need to be in order for us to be happy, having some deeper thoughts about what we're here to give as well as what we're here to get, having some deeper thoughts about situations where we can rise to the occasion and show up as our best for something more than just ourselves. So I think that it's almost like in the English language words, we have solitude, we have loneliness, and we have isolation. We don't have even when we talk about solitude, we need to go deeper into some of the beneficial aspects of solitude, even when it is forced solitude, because our real disease has been too much isolation, even when we are with other people. Mm-hmm. Now, when you're talking about, like when you were talking about my seminar, I believe that a sense of the relationship with a higher power. If you do not have a sense of relationship with the God of your understanding, if you don't have a relationship of where you come from, if that is from the spiritual perspective, if that relationship is fractured, Freud defined neurosis as separation from self. If there's a fracture in my sense of where I came from, there's a fracture in the sense of who I am. If there's a fracture in the sense of who I am, there's a fracture in my sense of who you are and who you will be to me. So I think a lot of people right now are digging deep into their spiritual practice, into a sense of religious and spiritual, whether it's in a secular context like AA, or whether it's a religious context, or whether it's a spiritual but not religious context. We're learning more about our deep humanity from all of this. We will not be, I just want to finish this by saying one thing. It's something that happened to me in Los Angeles, and I'm sure, Rabbi, that you have probably had similar experiences. I've officiated a lot of weddings, and I've officiated a lot of funerals. One day, many years ago in Los Angeles, I think it was probably in the 90s, it just happened serendipitously that I officiated at a funeral and a wedding on the same day. The funeral was a young woman who had been a real estate agent. And she was showing an apartment. It was in Ventura County somewhere. She was showing an apartment, and the man she was showing the apartment to murdered her. And she was a young woman with a 3-year-old baby. And the funeral was very well attended. They had a lot of friends. And I remember there was such a sense of, it doesn't get worse than that, obviously.
No.
And I remember talking to everybody. I remember the service was at the St. Thomas Episcopal Church there on Hollywood Boulevard. And I remember talking to the audience and talking about how I know you feel very alone in your grief, but you must not be alone in your grief. This man will need you raising this 3-year-old baby. And every woman here, this baby is without his mother, and you get to work. One of the things that's interesting, Catholics and Jews, when someone dies, they're told what to do. It's Protestants who often have a harder time because nobody's telling them what to do. But what was so profound for me that day was the look in the eyes of the man who was burying his wife. The sheer love. A few hours later, in doing a wedding with the couples who were about the same age, and the look of love in the eyes of the man who was getting married was so similar to the look of love in the eyes of the man who was burying his wife. As my father used to say, you take the good with the bad. What really matters is not the external circumstances. What really matters is that we love each other. If we love each other, we will not only get through this, we will be better as individuals and as a society on the other side of it.
Thank you, Marianne. That was right to the heart. It touched me as someone who buried a wife of cancer, 39 years old, and as someone who has done that as well, going from joy to sadness and sadness to joy. And what unites us is that, you know, there's a great expression in the Bible. There are two of them. Before I bring Dr. Drew back, one is when someone died, one of the patriarchs, they said they were gathered unto their people. They didn't say they died. They said they were gathered unto their people, which says so much. And the other expression, which was in this week's Bible Torah reading, when the God encounter between Moses and God occurred, it says they spoke face to face as a person would speak to his best friend, openly, without reservation, spilling it all, spilling your guts, knowing with great confidence that you're speaking to a source that can hear you and accept you. So, Dr. Drew, with these thoughts in mind, how do we go about building that community once we emerge? And we're going to emerge gradually from this hibernation, from this restriction. How do we build that realistically so it stays with us and doesn't just dissipate like a dream?
I don't have a prescription. However, we can all feel the pent up demand, right? You can feel how much people want to be around each other and spending time as socializing. But I don't think the three of us are disagree on anything. We're just sort of look, as you said, like a kaleidoscope, looking from a different perspective. And Marianne talked about attachment and love. And there are people that literally spend their entire careers studying just those two concepts. And the little sketch I gave you of the mom and the child interacting as bodies in space, we now know literally when you have a pain in your heart, it's actually your heart. It is giving information from the vagus nerves to your midbrain, sending it into something called the insular cortex, and then getting your attention by ringing up the amygdala. We now know what these things are, where they're going. We're still primitive in understanding that you have these large, literally brains distributed throughout our body. Some cultures call them chakras. What they're doing, what they're receiving, how they send information is a part of this business of people being in space and attaching to each other. What I want to emphasize is we do a terrible job of being close. We don't, as Marianne Open was saying, that there's a problem with the parent, why the kids don't want to be around the parent, because closeness has been a source of distress. Our most tender experiences early in life with that attachment, love experience early on. And if there's not enough of it, it's experienced as abandoning. If the source of the attachment and love also is a source of danger or trauma, it shatters the ability to be close forever. People won't re-enter that frame of closeness. And the strategy that child in development then develops is what we call narcissism. To get from the environment what you need to fill that void that's left by the lack of love and attachment. I was working in a psychiatric hospital in the early 80s. And when I first got there, you know, there's something called the Axis 2, which is where the personality disorders are inserted into the diagnostic sheets. And when I got there, there was cluster A, cluster B, dependency, all OCD, all kinds of personalities. By 1988, 1990, 1992, it was all cluster B, the narcissistic disorders. And the liability of narcissism, in addition to being unable to be close and tolerate closeness and really fill yourself with real relating, envy, aggression, emotional dysregulation, lack of appreciation of the feelings of others. And so right now we've been going through this massive wave, as Marianne said, of narcissism. And the big liability is not an ability to appreciate other people's feelings. And then envy, which is the Bible spells it out, Torah spells it out as that's the most destructive emotion humans can develop. It's not, hey, that guy has what I want, I like it, I'm going to work hard to get that. It's that guy's got what I want, I have to destroy him, I have to bring him down to my size. It's a terrible emotion, and we are replete with it. And interestingly, during COVID, I've seen a shift a little bit from narcissism to histrionic. If 4 years ago, somebody sat in my office and talked to me about wild conspiracy theories and seeing fascists and Nazis all over the place, they would be in the hospital. I would put them in the hospital. And that collectively has become a common discourse now. It's astonishing to me, the sort of collective delusional histrionic attitude we adopted during COVID. But again, if you don't have so many of the mechanisms that the three of us have been talking about here, our brain, our body is seeking ways to make meaning and to be okay. And we've already laid it out. It's others, it's community, it's spirituality.
You know, in the Kabbalah, the force that is evil or satanic is the ego, the desire to receive for the self alone, the opposite of sharing and giving lovingly. My question for both of you is, how do we emerge from this? What steps do we take so that all this pent-up emotion and desire to connect with others doesn't just represent a flash in the pan, but
Ladies
has
first.
some kind of permanence or continuity?
You know, the people who have, some of the times, people who have helped me the most have not been people who have said to me, I really feel bad about your pain, Marianne. Do you want to sit down and talk about it and process it? Even though I've always appreciated, we always do, when someone does care about our pain, let us process it. But I think that the moments that have been most transformative for me have been people who looked at me and went, who are you? Do you ever think about anybody else? I think we coddle each other's self-indulgence too much. I think there's a place where processing becomes spewing. And I think we do too much of it in our society. We give ourselves and others permission for this constantly going through it. And I know for myself, and I would consider myself a moody person. My astrological sign is Cancer. I have Venus in Cancerian. I have all that. And it's like that song, Simon and Garfunkel, hello, darkness, my old friend, you'll come to talk to me again. I know it, I see it. And this is what I know when I see myself there. It's like, hello, darkness, I know you. And I know two things. Number one, indulging you will get me nowhere. I'm sorry, three things. Indulging you will get me nowhere. I've lived enough to know there's no ultimate prize for indulging this. Number two, it will pass. And number three, call someone who has bigger problems than you do. You know, everybody says these days, reach out, but it's always like, reach out to talk about your problems. And something very powerful is to make a decision. That's what you do. You stare it down. You know, we tend to undervalue decision, emotional discipline. That's what we lack in this society. We lack emotional discipline. Right now, Marianne, it will not serve you at all to spiral into this. Pick up the phone and think about somebody who's probably more lonely than you, has bigger problems than you do, and for whom maybe a phone call from you would help them. And I've noticed the miracle that this is.
And I would drive that back to something the rabbi opened with was you use the word exposure, and I forget in what context to use it, but I wrote it down. And we are avoidant as opposed to exposing ourselves right now. And this is exactly what Marianne is talking about. And what I was talking about was being experiential, not being words and thoughts, being in an experience with other humans and exposing yourself to things that are uncomfortable. There are no safe spaces. Say when somebody develops a mental illness, we amplify the illness by cutting them off from the stimulus of their emotional issues. We expose them and they learn flexibility. This is where we started this conversation, adaptability, exposure, adaptability. And I totally agree with what Marianne is saying, that get out of our own head, and be available to somebody else, even if it's uncomfortable. Expose yourself to that and be open to the experience. Experiences become a vampire. That's the metaphor that I sort of opened with in my little presentation. And we've lost track of those experiences, I think, particularly the ones that are uncomfortable to us.
This has been so enlightening for me, and I'm sure for all of those who've been able to partake in this webinar. So I want to thank Marianne and Dr. Drew, and let's send this off with a final message of what we hope for. What are we hoping within our hearts will come about in the next weeks or months as we begin this emergent process? I know in my new website, Midnight Confessions and Corrections, I talked about we launched it on the full moon, the snow moon, and that's symbolic of really the earliest stages of coming out of hibernation. You see snow starting to melt just a bit, and the promise of a future is there, a future that will be spring and that will be renewal. What message would you like to send out to all of our listeners and those who've partaken in this webinar as we leave them today? Drew?
I don't like recipes. And so you'll see, you notice I'm avoiding that very carefully here today.
It's a message. It's a message.
I know, I'm with you. And I feel like we have delivered a pretty strong message to everybody through the constructs we presented. But I think don't rush it. We all feel it. Think about these very issues just think about it and be open to things. And we all talked about the lack of spiritual connectedness. Personally, I think a lot of that comes from community and others, but for sure, I use the higher power. Again, I see the miracle of recovery all the time, and there's always a connection with a higher power when people have that amazing connection, and whatever that is for you, give it some thought.
Marianne?
I think that I'd like to offer a prayer. Why don't we all just, in our own way, perhaps take a deep breath, close our eyes. And dear God, we know that you know the details of our burden, our stress, our struggle. We know that you know the worries that we have, the anxieties, the fears. Our children, our lovers, our friends, our spouses, our country, and our world. And we place in your hands, dear God, the walls that we have built in front of us that keep us from reaching out, that keep us from attracting great love, that make us constantly undermine and repel great love. And so we invite the Spirit of God, however we understand the Spirit of God, to enter into our hearts at this time, to heal us, to heal others, to heal our country, and to heal our world. We surrender all that we have and all that we are, and we ask that we ourselves be used, that we might contribute to the blessing that is the healing of us all. And so it is. Together, we all say, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Marianne. And I just send a wish for all of us to enjoy the true meaning of the word peace. In Hebrew is shalom, but it doesn't mean peace, the absence of war. It means wholeness. Wholeness. May you integrate into your life both the difficult moments like the ones we've been experiencing and the joyful ones. They're part of that whole package. May you be able to embrace that. Thank you again. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. An honor to be with you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Cheers.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.